Welcome to this comprehensive explainer. Today, we are undertaking a full forensic audit of biblical divorce and remarriage. Look, for a lot of us, especially when we're in our 20s and trying to navigate the absolute maze of modern relationships, marriage is basically viewed entirely through the lens of romance. It's all feelings and emotional connection, right? But in ancient biblical jurisprudence, marriage was legally recognized as a severe, highly binding bilateral contract. We're talking about a formal covenant. And just like any binding legal contract you'd sign today, it operates under very strict foundational terms. When those fundamental terms are violated, when the contract is shattered, the law actually has to provide a mechanism for justice. So, in this explainer, we are going to put these ancient texts under a microscope to uncover exactly how the original legal frameworks handled the destruction of this covenant. Okay, let's dive into this explainer's syllabus. We are going to methodically audit the specific legal mechanisms that dissolve this ancient contract. First up, we'll examine the divine paradox surrounding God's own actions regarding divorce. Next, we establish the Mosaic baseline to really understand ancient civil law. From there, we'll thoroughly audit the three legally recognized breaches: sexual immorality, willful desertion, and constructive desertion. And finally, we'll wrap up by delivering the definitive legal verdict on remarriage. Section 1. The Divine Paradox. To kick off our audit, we really have to look at a profound theological paradox. We constantly hear these sweeping, absolute statements regarding the divine view of marital dissolution. You know the ones. However, to truly grasp the jurisprudence here, we need to examine how the divine lawgiver himself actually interacted with the concept of divorce in the textual record. There's this massive, incredibly common assumption, mostly rooted in Malachi 2:16, that God unilaterally hates the legal act of divorce itself. But a strict exegesis actually corrects this. According to Gordon Hugenberger in his exhaustive scholarly work, Marriage is a Covenant, the prophet Malachi is essentially prosecuting the men of Judah for treating their wives with severe violence and treachery. Yahweh explicitly declares that he hates the covenantal treachery. He hates the act of wrongfully discarding an innocent wife just to marry a pagan woman. So what does this actually mean? It means God hates the covenant-breaking behavior that necessitates a divorce, not the forensic remedy of divorce itself. It is an absolutely vital legal distinction. The hatred is directed squarely at the crime, not the judicial response to the crime. And that brings us to a truly remarkable piece of textual evidence. Think about this logically for a second. If divorce is inherently and always a sin, God could not possibly participate in it, right? Yet, the Masoretic text actually personifies the divided nation as two covenanted sisters. Due to the Northern Kingdom's chronic, unrepentant spiritual adultery, God himself utilizes the Mosaic legal protocol. According to William Holliday in Jeremiah 1, a commentary, Yahweh literally issued a Sefer Kerathut, which translates to a scroll of cutting off, or a certificate of divorce to Israel. By the strict rules of classical logic, because Yahweh himself issued a certificate of divorce due to spiritual adultery, the legal execution of a divorce for unrepentant covenant betrayal literally cannot be inherently sinful. Actually, scratch that. It's more than just not sinful. It is a holy, righteous, and forensically justified execution of covenant law. Section 2. The Mosaic Baseline. Having established that a scroll of cutting off can indeed be a righteous legal instrument, we now need to transition over to the Old Testament foundational law. Specifically, we need to analyze Deuteronomy 24:1-4 to really understand the civil baseline established by Moses. In Matthew 19, Jesus identifies hardness of heart, the Greek term there is sclerocardia, as the root cause of the Mosaic concession for divorce. Now, according to the BDAG lexicon, sclerocardia doesn't just mean someone is in a bad mood. It refers to the stubbornness of the covenant people who volitionally refuse to adhere to the divine standard. Moses essentially permitted the certificate of divorce as a civil concession. It acted as a legal barrier. We really have to remember that in the ancient, highly aggressive patriarchal world, women often had literally zero rights. If a hard-hearted man hated his wife and had absolutely no legal avenue to dismiss her, he might easily resort to severe abuse or even murder just to get rid of her. So, the law forced him to write a formal public document, officially relinquishing his rights over her and granting her legal standing to remarry freely without any accusations of adultery. It was an ingenious system specifically designed to protect the vulnerable. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the intense first-century legal debate that laid a massive trap for Jesus. The text of Deuteronomy 24 allowed divorce for some indecency, which in Hebrew is erwat debar, while the school of Hillel focused entirely on the word debar, meaning any matter, creating this gigantic legal loophole. They argued a man could literally divorce his wife for trivial reasons, like burning his dinner, which functionally legalized serial adultery under the color of law. In stark contrast, the strict school of Shammai interpreted Irwat Debar as a shameful exposure or objective unchastity. So when the Pharisees asked Jesus if divorce was lawful for any cause, they weren't asking a general theological question. They were demanding he take a side in this highly specific, highly charged civil dispute. Section 3, Breach 1, Sexual Immorality. Jesus' response completely sweeps away the systemic distortion of those Hillelite loopholes and introduces us to the first formally recognized breach of the marital contract, sexual immorality. Jesus steps up and acts as the supreme expositor of the law, restricting that ambiguous Mosaic phrase exclusively to the Greek word porneia. But what exactly is porneia? Well, it's an overarching taxonomic category that encompasses adultery, incest, bestiality, and other unlawful sexual practices. According to Craig Keener in his book And Marries Another, porneia is completely unique because it is the specific act that forms an illicit one-flesh union with a third party. Because it mimics the marriage act, it functionally and literally shatters the spiritual and physical reality of the original marriage. Jesus' exception clause authorizes the innocent spouse to formally recognize that legal reality. The marriage contract hasn't just been dented, it has already been completely destroyed by the offender's betrayal. We really must contextualize this within the broader ancient justice system. Under the Sinai Covenant, adultery wasn't just a mistake, it was a capital offense, demanding the execution of both parties. However, biblical law also strictly required the testimony of 2 or 3 independent eyewitnesses to actually secure a death penalty. As David Instonebrewer brilliantly explains in his work Divorce and Remarriage in the Bible, the Sefer Kerathut, the divorce certificate, functioned as a highly merciful forensic alternative to execution. Think about it. If a husband strongly suspected adultery but just lacked the multiple eyewitnesses required for a full capital trial, or if he mercifully chose not to pursue the death penalty, which is exactly what Joseph initially intended to do with Mary, he could issue a divorce instead. It effectively achieved the exact same legal result: the permanent removal of the adulterer and the total freedom of the innocent. Section 4, Breach 2, Willful Desertion. We are now moving from the monocultural Jewish context of the Gospels straight into the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament era. Out here, the Apostle Paul had to handle massive cross-cultural legal dilemmas, specifically involving physical abandonment. In 1 Corinthians 7:15, Paul introduces this concept of chorsmos, which translates to willful desertion. He provides a clear legal release for a believer when an unbeliever unilaterally initiates separation. You see, in Roman law, a marriage was legally dissolved the exact moment one spouse physically walked out with the intent to end the union. Paul confirms here that this unilateral departure by an unbeliever fundamentally fractures the marital covenant. By physically and relationally departing, the unbeliever completely withholds all covenantal rights and executes an absolute, total breach of the marriage contract. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer depth of the forensic release Paul is granting here. He declares that the deserted believer is not enslaved. In the original Greek, that's au de doulotai. According to Anthony Thistleton in his comprehensive NIGTC commentary on 1 Corinthians, whenever Paul speaks of a marriage remaining intact, he consistently uses the verb dio, meaning bound by law. However, his highly deliberate choice of the word au de doulotai signifies a completed, permanent state of absolute freedom. He doesn't just casually say they are unbound, he legally certifies that the deserted believer is completely, 100% discharged from the servile contractual bondage of the marriage covenant itself. Section 5, Breach 3, Constructive Desertion. This leads us directly to the third breach, which honestly might be the most relatable concept for modern listeners. Today, we might refer to this as quiet quitting a marriage. Historically and legally, it is known as constructive desertion. Ancient Near Eastern law didn't just look at physical location to determine desertion. It looked heavily at material provision. Exodus 21:10 establishes 3 absolute, non-negotiable baseline rights even for a subordinate slave wife: food, clothing, and marital intimacy. If these were diminished in any way, she was legally emancipated. Drawing heavily on Raymond Westbrook's scholarly work Old Babylonian Marriage Law, we can easily apply a fortiori logic here, which is an argument from the lesser to the greater. If biblical law grants an absolute right of release to the absolute lowest status member of a covenant strictly due to material neglect, then a primary free wife absolutely holds these exact same mandatory contractual baseline protections. It's just logical. A free spouse cannot possibly possess fewer legal rights than a bondservant. Paul brings this exact Old Testament standard directly into the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 7. He commands spouses not to deprive one another, And the Greek term he utilizes there is apostereo. Now, this isn't just a polite suggestion. This is a hardcore legal commercial term, meaning to keep back by fraud or to rob someone of what is legally and rightfully theirs. In a marital context, systematically withholding intimacy or material support isn't just a breakdown in communication. It is literally robbing a spouse of their contractual rights. It is an ongoing, continuous material and relational theft of the core marital obligation. This principle of constructive desertion applies symmetrically across the board, reflecting very specific covenantal domains. A husband breaches the covenant by willfully withholding physical maintenance like food and clothing. A wife breaches it by unrepentantly defrauding her husband of intimacy or by intentionally destroying the household economy. According to George Knight's commentary on the pastoral epistles, specifically regarding 1 Timothy 5:8, Paul takes this incredibly seriously. A person who deliberately ruins the household economy or starves their family has functionally denied the Christian faith. They are forensically, legally reclassified as worse than an unbeliever. And because they are now legally viewed as an unbeliever who has abandoned their foundational obligations, that Pauline privilege of absolute release from 1 Corinthians 7 is immediately activated.
Section 6. The verdict on remarriage.
Okay, we have thoroughly analyzed the three contractual breaches: sexual immorality, willful desertion, and constructive desertion. We must now transition to the final, logical conclusion of this forensic audit: the legal realities of life after a biblically valid covenant dissolution. So, the crucial point and the ultimate takeaway of this entire explainer is this: in biblical law, a valid divorce equates to absolute, unequivocal freedom. There's this incredibly persistent myth in modern times, often called the separation-only view or the betrothal view, which claims you can be divorced but remain permanently ontologically bound to that person, rendering any new marriage adulterous. But according to John Murray, in his seminal work, Divorce, an intermediate divorce but bound status simply did not exist anywhere in ancient jurisprudence. It's a complete fiction. A valid divorce certificate functions specifically to grant the innocent party absolute legal immunity from adultery charges and the explicit documented freedom to become another man's wife. If the divorce is biblically warranted, the parties are legally single and completely free to remarry.
To deny the innocent party the right to remarry after their covenant has been shattered by treachery is honestly a profound violation of New Testament ethics. In 1 Corinthians 7:23, Paul issues the universal canonical mandate governing Christian liberty: "You were bought with a price, do not become slaves of men." To interpret the apostle's words as somehow prohibiting remarriage essentially forces the innocent party into a state of perpetual, lifelong celibacy, due entirely to the unilateral treachery of a covenant breaker. It effectively subjects the innocent believer to literal human enslavement, chaining them to a dead contract, and completely subverting the plain syntax of the text, which declares them legally emancipated and free. Well, we've officially reached the end of our audit. We've seen that marriage is a profoundly beautiful covenant, but when it is destroyed by sexual immorality, or when an unbeliever willfully walks away, or when a spouse systematically robs their partner of baseline survival rights, biblical jurisprudence actually provides a lawful forensic exit. And this leaves us with a highly provocative and frankly sobering question. If the divine lawgiver himself issued a certificate of divorce, and if the apostles so clearly established these legal rescue mechanisms to emancipate the innocent from treachery, why is our modern understanding so often forced the abused and the abandoned to remain in chains? It is absolutely time we profoundly rethink our grasp of this ancient jurisprudence. I strongly encourage you to open these texts and deeply audit this history for yourself.